everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain. And today we are going to talk about, can we give Korbanot without a Beit HaMikdash? Why are we going to talk about this? For a couple of reasons. But the first one I want to say is there was literally just a headline about people trying to sneak a goat onto Beit, onto the Temple Mount yesterday. This is May 13th, 2025, that I am recording this. So let it be known forever that this happened yesterday. But the reason why I'm bringing it up now is because the Gemara in Shevuot on Daf Tet Zayin Amud Aleph talks about the possibility of being Makrif Korbanot, giving Korbanot when there is no physical structure of the Mikdash standing. And interestingly enough, in the 19th century, this was a real live discussion among, I would say, two groups of people. And I think these two groups of people make very interesting bedfellows. One is our religious Zionists. And when I say our religious Zionists, I actually mean basically Rav Kalisher, right? So when people learn about the beginning of religious Zionism, they often learn about two personalities, Rav Alkali and Rav Kalisher. Rav Kalisher actually asks the Shaila of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, his Rebbe, about whether Korbanot can be given even in the absence of a Mikdash. Now, it does not seem like he was going to give any Korbanot just as of yet, but as his Messianic religious Zionism is developing, at some point, that probably will be something that he wants to try to do. And the other group, because he asked Rabbi Akiva Eiger, whose son-in-law was the Chatam Sofer, head of a very important Haredi posek, it turns out that it's the Chatam Sofer who ends up giving the answer to Rav Kalisher. So we're going to see how that goes. So it's always interesting to see Zionists and Haredim as bedfellows in this conversation. Okay, so let's go to our sources. I think it's one of those things that is simply just intriguing. And, you see something in the Gemara that is talking about the time of Ezra, which is where this conversation comes up in the Gemara. And you wonder to yourself, hey, what impact does that have on today? And guess what? It does. Now, we probably could go further and ask about the different petitions by the Machon HaMikdash. I think the Machon HaMikdash, maybe others, to give the Korban Pesach from the Supreme Court in Israel. I'm not up on when the last time that happened was, but it certainly has to do with this as well. So let's look at our Gemara in Shevuot, Daf Tet Zayin Amud Aleph. And the discussion is a machloket over whether Kedusha Rishona, Kid Shalashata, Ula Atid Lavo, or Vikitcha Latid Lavo, or Kedusha Rishona, Kid Shalashata, Velo Kitcha Latid Lavo. Do we say that the original Kedusha of the Mikdash, of Beit, is something that continues to last from the first Beit HaMikdash, or is it something that lapsed at the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash? And what that would basically mean is, even if Ezra could reconsecrate it in the second Beit HaMikdash, that after the Chorban Beit, that would also be lapsed, right? So without a Beit HaMikdash, we don't have the Kedusha. And within that context, the Gemara in Shevuot comes up with Tanai. Here's a Machloket Tanaim. Did Tanya Amar Rabbi Eliezer Shamatik Shayu Bonin Bahechal Asu Klaim Lahechal Uklaim Lazarot. Says, I heard that when they were building the Hechal, when they were building the second Beit HaMikdash, they made curtains for the Kodesh, right, which is the Hechal, and they made curtains for the Azarot, which is further out. El shebehechal bonin mibachutz. When it came to building the Kodesh, they built the wall of the Kodesh outside of the curtains. Uva Azarot bonin mibifnim. But in terms of the Azarot, which are further out, they built the walls from inside the curtains. But the point is here, it seems like they had to put up some sort of structure in order to create a Mikdash so that they could use it for Korbanot. On the other hand, Amar Rabbi Yeshua, and this is citing a Mishnah in Eduyot, Amar Rabbi Yeshua, Shamati, I heard, Shemakrivin Afal Pi She'ein Bayit, that you can give Korbanot even if there is no physical temple structure. Ochlin Kodshe Kadashim Afal Pi She'ein Klaim, you're allowed to eat holy of holy Korbanot meat, which you're supposed to eat within the what's the word I'm looking for? Within the curtains, even if there are no actual curtains, and kachim kalim, umaser sheni, afal pishin choma. You can also eat the meat from lower level sacrifices, and you can also eat your maser sheni, both of which have to be eaten lifnim min hachoma in Yerushalayim, within the wall of the city of Jerusalem, even if there is no actual wall. Why? Because the original Kedusha of the Beit HaMikdash from the first time, it obtains continually. Okay? So what we have here is seemingly a machloket, although the Gemara is going to discuss further, but seemingly a machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua as to whether the Kedusha Rishona is maintained. Now, the truth is, the Ravid did paskin that the Kedusha Rishona is not maintained, which essentially means anytime you don't have a bayit, you don't have Kedusha. So it would be forbidden to give Korbanot. However, the Rambam says the Kedusha Rishona did obtain, so even without a bayit, you still have the Kedusha originally of the first Beit HaMikdash. Lefichach, says the Rambam in Hilchot Beit HaBechira, Lefichach makrivin korbanot kulan af she'en sham bayit banui. Therefore, you can give all korbanot even if the house is not built, the temple is not built. Ve'ochlin kodshe kadashim b'chol ha'azara af she'i chareva ve'ena mukefet b'mechitza. Same thing we said. The highest level korbanot in terms of the holiness rung, even if the Mikdash, even if the Azara is not extant, right? You can eat it in that area. Same thing when it comes to kachim kalim. Same thing when it comes to eating maser sheni. All of Jerusalem, even if there are no walls. Because the original kedusha obtains. It's not about there still being an actual structure. Okay? So the truth is, we do have really interesting discussions throughout history. Apparently, maybe in the 4th century, Jews tried to rebuild Mizbeach in Yerushalayim and give korbanot. Maybe in the 17th century, there's testimony about people trying to give korbanot. But the truth is, you don't need to look any further than a Mishnah in Pesachim, Ketzad Solan et Pesach. How do you roast the Pesach? Amar Rabbi Tzadok. Rabbi Tzadok says, Maaseh Rabbi Gamliel, Sha'amar LaTevi Avdo. A situation happened where Rabbi Gamliel said to Tevi, who was his servant, go roast the Paschal lamb on the grill. Now, Rabbi Gamliel, let's look at Rabbi Gamliel's dates. When does Rabbi Gamliel live? Well, if you're guessing it, you're right. Rabbi Gamliel actually lives even after the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. So why are they giving a Korban Pesach if you're not allowed to give Korbanot without a Mikdash? Right? So that is a very important piece of precedent that is going to inform our 19th century debate. Now, I told you that Rav Kalisher, Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher, his Rebbe was Rabbi Akiva Eger, and he asked Rabbi Akiva Eger, may we give korbanot? Because, of course, Rav Kalisher thought of Eretz Yisrael and the possibility of going back to Eretz Yisrael, creating Bayit Shlishi as a Mashiachiyut, as a messianic possibility. And he wanted to know, let's talk about korbanot. And Rabbi Akiva Eger basically said to him, I'm going to ask my son-in-law what he thinks. And his son-in-law, the Chatam Sofer, being big Haredi posek, let's see what the Chatam Sofer says. Okay, so this is a responsum. It is a tshuva from the Chatam Sofer to his father-in-law, to Rabbi Akiva Eger. Pretty remarkable. Okay. Yikrat Kodsho Higiani, Umash Katav Mori V'chami Hagaon Hero Yair Levakesh Misarei Yerushalayim Litain Reshut LaHakriv So he says, your letter reached me, and the question of asking the officers of Jerusalem to give the possibility of giving korbanot, who kapdan gadol. Now, he is very stubborn. Now, who's the he? I'm assuming he's saying your student, Rav Kalisher, who asked you this, is very stubborn. Kiyahu Amar Labal Yakri Labal Yakriv Sham Misha Eno Emunat Yishmael, or maybe Labal Yikrav Sham, I'm not sure. It says that's such a crazy question because nobody who is not Muslim is allowed to go there. Kisham Nibne Beit HaAvodah Shelahem, because their house of worship is on the Temple Mount. Meaning, this is a question that has no practical ramifications. It is 1836. The Muslims are on the Temple Mount, and it's not clear to me if whether we're saying nobody's even allowed to go there if they're not Muslim, or it's saying nobody's allowed to sacrifice there where they're not Muslim. But he says, okay, but let's talk about the issue anyway, even theoretically. At any rate, what you wrote, my father-in-law, whose light should burn bright, manaset mitoma kahuna avechoshen, is the questions that you have about whether this would be permitted, right? For example, what are we going to do with the fact that we're all tmei mate? We have all been exposed to impurity of the dead, and we don't have a red heifer, we don't have a paraduma to do anything about it, right? Or yichosei kahuna, do we even know which priests are actually pedigreed? Says, all right, well, let me answer some of those questions for you. He says, Hine besefer kaftor v'ferach, Perek Shlishi. There is a book called Kaftor v'Perach, or v'Ferach, that was written, I think, in the 14th century, and it's basically about mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz, mitzvot that are dependent on, it can only be done in Eretz Yisrael. It says in the third parak there, in the third chapter there, Katav Sherav Chaim Paris Alali Yerushalayim Shnat Yud Zayin le'elef hashishi. He says Rav Chaim of Paris went to Jerusalem in the 17th year of the 6,000th year, right? The 6th millennium. So I went back and said, okay, that's 5017. That seems like it's 1257 of the Common Era. Va'amar laharav shorotzeh lakriv korbanot, and he said he wants to give korbanot. Va'amar mitoch tirda lo sha'alti al atoma v'kohen miyuchas, and he says out of just preoccupation, I didn't ask about the issue of, well, what about ritual impurity, and what about not knowing if the priests that we say today are kohanim are actually pedigreed, if they really go back to proper kehuna. Shuv katav, but then he wrote, meaning the Kaftor Ferach wrote, Halo Tuma Hutra B'tzibor. He said, well, the truth is, we say that if Rov Kohanim, if most of the Kohanim, or Rov Yisrael, most of Israel, are Tameh, we still allow, right? We say Tuma Hutra B'tzibor. We are, for Korbanot Tzibor, we allow, even if people are Tameh. And Umikoin Miyuchas Lo His Kir Klal Terutz. He didn't say anything about the question of pedigree. She says, okay, well, how can we resolve that problem? Uviyayvitz in Rav Yaakov Emden ben Tzvi, meaning in Rav Emden's work, Chelik Aleph Siman Peitet, Hevi Mimenu Bekitzur, he wrote a little bit about it. V'katav alav sheyesh lish'ol gam al shiklei tzibur. He was also curious about the fact that usually when we do Korbanot Tzibur, it comes out of the shkalim that the tzibur give, right? Meaning it's used from, we collect a machatzira shekel from people every year, right? And Adar time. And we use that for Korbanot Tzibur, right? So are you allowed to do anything if it's, any Korban Tzibur, if it didn't come from that? So he says, oh, v'ulai Korban Pesach ratzah lakriv. Maybe what we're talking about is this person, Rav Chaim of Paris, wanted to give the Korban Pesach. Why? Because when we say Tuma Hutra B'tzibor, we invoke that about Pesach. V'lo ba'ishkalim, and also the Korban Pesach doesn't have to come from the shkalim of the people, right? V'hinei bigdei kahuna lo shalu. They didn't ask anything about, well, can you actually do this without the proper vestments? Ki pashutu shein kai gavna ma'akev v'nuchal akriv biladel. Right? Everybody knows, bigdei kahuna, the clothing, the vestments of the Kohen are not absolutely required in the sense that if you don't have them, the korban is null. Right? Umasha katav miyichus kahuna. It says, and the issue of pedigreed kohanim or non-pedigreed kohanim, nira de lo kashimidi la Rav Chaim. Doesn't seem like that was a question for Rav Chaim of Paris. Deman lemalan de lo yakriv achazaka. Who says that we don't just, it's not enough to have a chazaka if we have a presumption about somebody's a Kohen? Who says that we don't, that's not enough to let people be makriv a korban as a Kohen? Tekay malan, because we hold Barech Hashem Chelo Ufal Yadav Yirtzeh, and Barech Hashem Chelo, right, which really means God blesses, God's army, right? It's actually Afilu Chalulim Shebahem. Even those are Chilulim Shebahem from the Gemara in Makot. Even those who are profaned, meaning, okay, so maybe you're a halal, maybe you're not perfectly pedigreed, maybe it's not perfect, but we're okay. Okay. So basically, what it seems like is the Chatam Sofer says to him, you're good, right? In theory, you could actually give Korbanot. Now, what I think is quite interesting is this is in 1836. It does not seem like Rav Kalisher is in any position to actually give Korbanot, or at least a Korban Pesach, right? Any Korbanot, but let alone give the Korban Pesach. It seems like it's mutter, it's allowed, but he's not in any position to give it. Now, one thing you need to know between this source and the next source that we're going to look at is that in 1857, some rumor began that the Jews who were living in the Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael actually wanted to literally go give Korbanot. Now, when that happened, and it wasn't just theoretical, when that happened, boom, some of the responses were, no, you can't do that. Don't do that. This is a bad idea, right? When it moved from the theoretical into the practical, there was a whole host of rabbinic responses that were anti. But I think it's interesting to note, and this is something that I have on the bottom, people can look at it later, there's an academic named Dr. Jody Myers who suggests that, one of the ways you could read the Chatam Sofer's response of allowing Korbanot is, he's not doing this for messianic purposes, right? The way that Rav Kalisher was, but this may be important to emphasize in light of the Reform movement, because the Reform movement around the same time, they're taking out references to Korbanot and Messianism from their Sidurim. So to be able to say, no, we can even give Korbanot now is significant. And there's a whole body of literature that emerges, and the Chatam Sofer is part of this also, talking about how prayer, tefillah, is secondary to Korbanot, that it really isn't the best form of avoda. It really isn't the best form of worship. So it's interesting. Again, like the religious Zionist Haredi overlap here is kind of interesting. But look at what happens in 1862, right? This is, 25, 26 years later. And this is the very first tshuva in Rav Yaakov Ettlinger's Ettlinger's book of Responsa. Now, it's interesting that he puts it front and center. I will tell you, because he's going to say to Kalisher, you can't do this. It's Kalisher asking the same question. He says to Kalisher, you can't do this. And fascinatingly, he and Kalisher had a whole back and forth, but Ettlinger doesn't include it in the tshuva. Like, he's not interested in what Rav Kalisher responded. He's interested in saying, you can't do this. And let's see what he has to say. Okay, so this is written in Altona in Hamburg, Germany. Al Dvar Asher Hela Malat Kvod Torato Nero Yair Besifro Hayakar Shechova Mutal Al Kol Yisrael Ishtadel Gam Bizman Hazeh Terem Biat Mishichenu Lakriv Korbanot B'Mkom HaMikdash Al Yidei Binyan HaMizbeach Kemo Sheikrivu B'Mei Ezra Terem Binyan Beit Sheni Kedetnan Sof Ediot V'Ratza B'Chasto L'Habia Lo Da'ati Al Zeh. says, on that which, your eminence, right? He's treating him with great respect. Your eminence wrote in your book that look at how practical it's. We have a responsibility to try to build a mizbeach and to give korbanot today. And you asked me to express my opinion on this. He says, the answer is no. Okay. But it's more complicated than that. He says, Afilu takribu b'makom HaMikdash, achar she'chared, de'en b'ze it's iser chutz. Even if you are actually giving the korban in the place of the Mikdash, once it's destroyed, which is not an iser of shchutei chutz, that's not a problem of giving a korban outside of the Mikdash. Because we do say that the original kedusha from the first Beit HaMikdash stays and obtains. Says ve'ein tzarich mechitzot, and you don't need walls, meaning you don't need a structure. And here's where it comes. He says mikol makom, nonetheless, lo ariach bereach nichoach. I will not smell your fragrance. What does this mean? He is quoting a pasuk from Vayikra Kavav Lamed Aleph. V'natati et arechem chorba. I will lay waste to your cities. V'hashimoti et mikdashechem. I will desolate your sacred places. V'lo ariach bereach nichochem. And I will not smell your fragrances. Meaning, he says, great, there's nothing technically wrong. God does not smell the fragrances of korbanot until Yemot HaMashiach. None of this messianic Zionism. Religious Zionism, maybe, but not messianic Zionism. Although I don't know Rav Ettlinger's opinion on Zionism, to be honest. But bottom line, lo ariach bereach nichochem. That is the problem, right? So really interesting. How does Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher himself deal with this? Not something that is brought in Rav Ettlinger's Shevuot. Well, in his book, Drishat Zion, B'chein Masha Katav HaGaon Mi Altona, he says, that which Rav Ettlinger wrote, Minkra Delo Ariach, from the pasuk of I shall not smell your korbanot, She'eino l'ratzon, that it will not be to God's, it won't have the acceptance of God. That doesn't mean that God will never smell the fragrance. Rak b'dor shayu adukim b'avodat elilim uv'shar averot gedolot. That only referred to the time when they were involved in idolatry and other great sins. That's when God says, because remember, it's coming from the tochacha, it's coming from the rebuke section in Bechukotai, where God says, if you are terrible sinners, I am going to destroy you, God forbid, and I will not smell your reach nichoach. And he says, that's when that's when God's not going to smell it. Kimosha Amar, like it says in Yeshayahu, Chodshechem u'moadechem sana nafshi, that my soul says God I hate your Rosh Chodesh and I hate your holidays. So should we no longer have Rosh Chodesh even today? And we should no longer have holidays? I mean, he's trying to say that was talking about a particular time, a particular moment, right? So he had an answer to Rav Ettlinger. And I wonder if what Rav Ettlinger was telling him is, if Mashiach's not here, Mashiach's not here, right? There might be more to it. One thing to note is that the Nitziv actually, he talks about the fact that Korban Pesach doesn't say Reach Nichoach regarding it, right? B'chol Korbanot k'tiv Reach Nichoach Zulat Pesach she'eno karev l'Reach Nichoach mishum hachi karev achar Korban kol zman shaya mizbeach kayam. He says, why did Rabbi Gamliel, and then he talks about Rabbi Gamliel after that, why did Rabbi Gamliel give the Korban Pesach after the Beit HaMikdash was already destroyed? Because Korban Pesach doesn't say Reach Nichoach, so it doesn't have to be. It doesn't say Reach Nichoach. So you don't have that problem. Now, I will add one more thing, which is I think it's very nice once I know that our topic is can we give korbanot without a mikdash, and it looks like it's natun b'machloket, and it also looks like it relates to messianism, right? And that's really might be what is at odds, and maybe also it's an Orthodox Reform polemic of making sure no korbanot are still important, and don't forget that korbanot are important, and don't think that they're primitive, and et cetera, et cetera. But also, while we're on the topic of the fact that Korban Pesach seems to be the outlier to a lot of things, right? It's interesting to see Rabbi Rosenzweig has a great piece about Korban Pesach. He says the Torah consistently describes the Korban Pesach as Pesach LaHashem, implying a special expression of devotion and recognition of Hashem's role, meaning Hashem's role in Yetziat Mitzrayim. The fact is that this korban is not developed in the Torah in the context of other sacrifices, just as it is not sacrificed within the traditional time frame bracketed by the two tzmidim, right? The korban tamid in the morning and the korban tamid in the afternoon. Usually when you're giving a korban, it should be in between those. Korban Pesach is not in between those. Unlike other korbanot, there is no focus even on ritzui. There's no conversation of like it should be liratzon, right? It should be pleasing to God. No hint of the otherwise ubiquitous concept of ishe reach nichach. And then he says, Sichatam Sofer, Nitziv, and other poskim regarding the possibility of its sacrifice in the aftermath of the Korban Bayit, of the destruction of the Mikdash. And there's no special portion for the Kohanim. Korban Pesach is sometimes formulated as a Korban Tzibur, a public Korban, though the mitzvah, meaning communal korban, though the mitzvah devolves upon each individual and is achieved by means of voluntary groupings. This korban defies classification because its role is unique, right? So that's also an interesting thing to put in there. But nonetheless, what I would say is a Mishnah in Eduyot that our Gemara in Shevuot quoted of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, ostensibly a machloket over whether Kedusha Rishona, Kid Shalashata, Vikid Shalatid Lavo or not, actually ends up being the backbone of a discussion in the 19th century among Messianists, among Haredim, ends up being a discussion even today. And I would say not that it was the Korban Pesach that people tried to give yesterday, but it was a Korban for Pesach Sheni. So it sort of was the Korban Pesach. This stuff is still alive today and raises all the questions about Mashiachiyut, Messianic tensions, and religion, and what's Jewish about the Jewish state, and what's religious about the religious, and what's religious about the Jewish state. So a lot to think about. Thanks, everyone. And I know this is an evergreen shear, but don't forget to count the Omer.